Make your voice be heard. Be sure to sign and share the petition to free the Hammonds from federal prison. Watch Sibel Edmonds and Todd Macfarlane discuss the petition to release the Hammonds at the end of this video. Welcome to this special edition of Probable Cause with Newsbud's founder and editor Sibel Edmonds. Today, Sibel's guest is Todd Macfarlane, who is an attorney, a rancher, a writer, and a political activist. Based in Utah, Todd has represented multiple ranchers in long-standing struggles with the federal government. Welcome to Probable Cause with Sibel Edmonds.
Well, welcome, Todd. It's been a while since we had a discussion on these very, very important topics regarding the ranchers' dilemma and their struggle without the public support due to the, of course, mainstream media and the pseudo-alternative media here in the United States. Interestingly, yesterday we had a guest from 10th Amendment Center, Mike Mahari, and we had a great one-hour discussion about the states' rights versus the federal government and the federal government's overreach. And this interview, this discussion is going to really nicely fit in with the interview we conducted yesterday. We published it today. Recently, you and a group of activists launched a petition on Hammond's case. Until recently, about 2 years ago, I didn't even know about the Hammond's case. Again, thanks to the mainstream and pseudo-alternative media outlets. And as soon as I started reading about this case and then doing additional research on this, I was outraged. It was one of those cases that I would say truly boiled my blood temperature, my blood. I have to say I was first very shocked that this case did not garner really big national attention. And then the second was what was taking place here in this country, in the United States of America, supposedly governed under the separation of powers, and the fact that most people don't know about this, that alone is worthy of a separate edition for us to discuss, to talk about. But let's start with this petition and with you telling our viewers about Hammond's case, starting from the beginning. What is this Hammond's case? And what is this petition and what it is that you're trying to accomplish?
Well, thank you, Sibel, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. It's interesting because the petition, it is a new petition, that's true, but this is an issue that's been going on for some time, and it was actually the impetus. In other words, the Hammond case, the Hammond situation, was the impetus for Ammon Bundy to go to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. And it caused all of that to happen. A lot of people don't realize that the Hammond case was at the foundation of all of that, because a lot of people were, just like you've described, outraged about how the Hammonds were being treated at that point in time. Now, a lot of people don't know the backstory, and it's true that, frankly, even if we talk about higher profile names like the Bundys, Ammon Bundy, Cliven Bundy, their cases, Lavoy Finicum, I think if you really did a survey, I think that probably 75% of all Americans still wouldn't even know who we're talking about. In other words, these aren't really household names. Now, here in the West, and for people who are interested in these issues, then we're well acquainted with those names. But the point is, the Hammonds, Dwight and Steven Hammond, they have much less name recognition, and their case has a whole lot less recognition than these other cases, but they fit into this whole puzzle in a very important way. So if we go back, what it boils down to is Dwight and Steven Hammond are ranchers in Harney County, Oregon, which is a vast swath of Oregon that's basically just mountain and desert. And they own a ranch that's in close proximity to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. That's where their valley property is. And then they have summer range on Steens Mountain. But anyway, it is an area that's kind of garnered a lot of attention from environmental activists. And so what it boils down to in a nutshell is going back a period of time, and we're talking 20 years, the Hammonds have been in conflict with the federal government based on their ranching operation. And if you stand back and look at the big picture at this point in time, it's quite obvious what's been going on. What's been going on is that environmental activists, together with the federal government, have simply been trying to push them out of business, to push them off the land. They've acquired many of the surrounding ranches and their grazing allotments, and there's a big portion of Steens Mountain now, almost 200,000 acres, that is completely cattle-free because these environmentalists, together with the federal government, wanted to get rid of all livestock on the mountain. But the Hammonds, they didn't go along with all of those things. They didn't go along with getting pushed out. So from a very early point in time, they were kind of targeted, and they've been pushed, and they've really been retaliated against in a lot of ways. But it all came to a head when they were ultimately charged with arson in federal court in Pendleton, Oregon, based on a fire that occurred on their ranch. Now, their ranch consists of both private property and what are often referred to as public lands, in other words, federal lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management. And this fire, which was a backfire, they intended, the only reason there was any fire there was to attempt, in terms of any fire that they started, was this management tool of attempting to create a backfire to protect other property. And for those that are familiar with that, realize that backfires are often used because once you start a backfire and it burns, then there's no more fuel there left to burn, and so the fire stops there. So they had started this little backfire on their own private property to try to protect their ranch, and it kind of spread a little bit and actually consumed about 140 acres of BLM land there, the forage on this land, which is basically just brush, a little bit of grass, that sort of thing. 140 acres here in the West, in a place like Harney County, Oregon, is not a very big area at all. We're talking 140 acres in the middle of hundreds of thousands of acres. Even in the court case, they determined that the value of the forage that it consumed was less than $1,000. But they were prosecuted for arson, and they were tried, in my opinion, in a very retaliatory prosecution. They were tried, and ultimately, and this is something a lot of people are confused about, they were not actually convicted based on the evidence. After they were worn down, after several weeks of trial, after spending years doing this, they ultimately entered into a plea agreement during the course of the trial with the federal government and agreed to plead guilty to one count of arson, and they would be sentenced on that. And there were some other terms that I think are crazy. Among other things, they agreed that they would give the Bureau of Land Management a right of first refusal to buy their entire ranch if they ever decided to sell. The BLM, the federal government, insisted that that be a term of this plea agreement because they were so determined to acquire that ranch. In addition to the prison sentence was the fine. You've probably heard, but they agreed, the federal government insisted on a fine of $400,000. $400,000. And then they were kind of throwing themselves on the mercy of the court to determine the prison sentence. They were willing to give a right of first refusal. They were willing to pay the fine in the amount of $400,000, which they did. But in the original sentencing, Judge Michael Hogan thought that the federal mandatory minimum sentences for that particular crime, in other words, arson, but the problem is, under these federal mandatory minimum sentences, there is this terrorism enhancement that caused that to go from what would otherwise maybe be a crime for which you might, if you were a first-time offender, in other words, if you didn't have a criminal history or anything like that, you probably wouldn't be sentenced to spend any time in prison whatsoever. But under these enhancements, it required that the sentence be, because it was federal property. So that's the thing. It could have happened anywhere else, and you would not spend any time whatsoever. But because it was federal property, and they made a big deal of this, in other words, it burned some federal sagebrush, under the minimum mandatory sentencing guidelines, they were supposed to spend at least 5 years in prison. Well, Judge Michael Hogan, just before he was set to retire, said he found that under the conditions and circumstances of that case to be outrageous. He thought it shocked the conscience that this 73-year-old rancher and his 40-year-old son should spend 5 years in prison after paying $400,000 and all of these other things, being prosecuted and persecuted for years. So he sentenced the son, the younger, to a full year in prison and his father to 3 months in prison, and they both served those terms. So Dwight Hammond went to prison for 3 months, his son went for a year. But this is the part, and this is the sticking point. The federal government itself appealed the sentence, thought that that sentence was too light, and thought that Judge Hogan had abused his discretion in giving them some leniency. So it went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit overturned Judge Hogan's sentence and found that under these federal mandatory minimum sentencing requirements, that he had no discretion, that judges basically have no discretion whatsoever. Doesn't matter who the people are, what the circumstances are. If you apply these terrorism enhancements, which is what they did, then they would have to serve at least 5 years. So at that point in time, they were resentenced to go back and serve the full 5 years each. And it's at that point that a lot of people started really becoming outraged about that. That was late 2015. That was during the holidays of 2015, going into the new year of 2016, which is when Ammon Bundy and a number of other people went to Burns, Oregon, to protest this travesty that was going on with respect to the Hammonds. And the offshoot of that was that they went out to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and occupied the refuge to try to bring attention to the Hammond case and what was going on. So that's kind of a nutshell version, Sibel.
Well, before I continue with the petition and what the petition that you have just released is asking for, I have questions. I have so many questions. I wish we had like 5 hours to go through these questions. Now, this was in order to prevent the spread of fire that actually you are required to do. And in this particular case, what they did actually saved so much land from the spread of this fire. Is that correct?
That is correct, Sibel. The reality is that even the BLM or the Forest Service and their firefighters, they all use backfires as a regular tool when fighting other fires. The other thing that's really interesting to understand is that under federal law, if you are a grazing allottee, in other words, if you have a grazing allotment like the Hammonds did, it specifically says in the law that applies to that if for some reason you start a fire that's really burning the forage that you have the right to use. In other words, what you're burning is the feed that your cattle would be eating. And so they recognize that. They recognize that this is something that you have a right to, that you're simply supposed to cooperate with getting the fire put out, but there's no other penalty. There are no other major consequences. It's not going to be treated as arson, terrorism, or something like that. That is the law that should have applied to their situation, but in this malicious prosecution that occurred based on this small acreage, the federal government tried to blow it into something that it wasn't.
Now, I'm just right now trying to think and come up with cases of mega corporations who have, because of their recklessness, because many of them are so greedy, have caused things like environmental pollution, either through oil spill, that we have had so many of these instances, You're looking at, in some cases, because of fracking, it's polluting and poisoning the water in this entire area. I'm talking about counties after counties, affecting the entire states. And I can't, and I don't remember a single case where the CEOs, the owners, the large shareholders of mega corporations causing irreparable damage from polluting the environment, oil spills, destroying the land, going to jail under some domestic terrorism law. Can you think of any cases whatsoever where we have mega corporation CEOs and owners, okay? These are the people with billions of dollars, for doing damage, polluting, poisoning people, going to jail and actually serving jail sentences?
So off the top of my head, I can't think of any, Sibel, but I think you make a really important point, and it's an important distinction between those situations that you've described, and we all know that there are a lot of those out there, despite whatever precautions might be taken, situations where there are serious consequences that affect a lot of other people and a lot of other natural resources. In this situation, there was no damage to anyone else. There was no damage to, it was a renewable resource. In other words, forage, range forage that would grow back the next year as soon as there was enough rainfall to allow it to do so. And it was forage that they already had the right to use, the right to consume through their livestock. So no one else was damaged by this. There were no other consequences, but despite that, they were treated on a very discriminatory, retaliatory basis like you've described, that we haven't seen with anybody else that is engaged in much more egregious behavior, whether it was intentional or not.
Here's another question I have, Todd, and that has to do with, because I know the mainstream media, pseudo-alternatives, various NGOs who are funded by special interests, they have been putting this environmentalism or on behalf of environmentalism twist into this case and similar cases. But there are certain facts about that whole Malheur area and these ranches that has not garnered the deserved attention that basically counters this environmentalism spin that is being put on these cases. For example, based on my research, I found out that there is this private company, Uranium One. It's a foreign company. It's a foreign company that has been giving tens of millions of dollars to Clinton and Clinton Foundation and have business arrangements with them. And they also have business arrangements, with Russians. Before all this stuff took place, they have been trying to acquire these parcels, these lands from the ranchers for uranium yellowcake mining, okay? Because this area in Oregon is really, really rich in uranium. So these people, and I'm sure, I'm almost sure that Hammonds were also approached, because this mega company, this multi-billion-dollar companies, they came to Oregon, they came to this region, and they've been trying to convince ranchers to sell their lands. And not only that, they also have this arrangement with the feds, with the federal government. Now, how is it that it's okay to lease federal land and these ranches being sold to these companies, to private companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, to have them mine for uranium, which does, from what I know, does a lot of damage to the land. Is that correct? How can that be acceptable, and there are no issues of environmentalism and activism raised in that kind of a very, very obviously environmentally threatening case for the same area, for the same land, including the public land, and yet for a rancher there to protect his whatever 100 acres, and it becomes like an environmentalist issue. How these two things actually work together? Because I just see this huge discrepancy.
There really is, Sibel. There's a huge discrepancy, and what you've just described is a huge, what I would call double standard. So it depends on who you are, of course. So if you're these little ranchers, Dwight and Steven and Susie Hammond out there on the land, that don't have all this political clout and all the multi-billion dollars that you're talking about and all the political connections, and I'm going to say it like this, the facade of environmental protection, because that's something that I think if you really do drill down on a lot of this, I think there are a lot of things that happen on the surface, on the face, to make it appear as if something is being done for the sake of environmental conservation. But if you really drill down to see who the real powers behind it, the real money behind it, the real driving force behind it, that there's an ulterior motive. There's an ulterior motive, and it really has more to do with resource exploitation and extraction. And as you've said, uranium mining, compared to ranching especially, I mean, ranching is just about as environmentally friendly use of the resources I can imagine, because they're out there putting these renewable resources, forage and water, to beneficial use. And these are renewable resources, and they don't really pollute anything or degrade it in any way. I know that a lot of people try to put their spin and their twist on it, but really ranching worldwide, and especially in the West, is really a very, even compared to industrial farming. So if we even stay in the agricultural industry or sector, and you compare Western ranching in the West and what goes on, whether it's the use of chemicals and fertilizers and all of those things that happen in industrial agriculture versus the way these lands and resources are managed with livestock in the West, I mean, it doesn't even compare, let alone to uranium mining. But they try to make these ranchers the bad guys and try to somehow, just like they've done with loggers and the whole timber industry, so that they can push them out. And frankly, my own view, and I know that there are people who say, well, that's just conspiracy theory and all of that sort of thing, but there are big, well-funded powers that really what they're trying to do is tie up these resources for their own ultimate use. They want to get everybody else out of the picture that might have a use, that might have a claim to the land, including these ranchers. And then at whatever point in time they decide they want to extract and exploit those resources, they've got a green light to do it. I really think that the deeper we dig down on all of these issues, the more of that we will really find.
And that's exactly what we have been seeing based on tons of research we did during the Malheur protests. And we did come under this intense attack by the left, by the environmentalists, who I attribute it to their ignorance, because, again, thanks to the mainstream and the pseudo-alternative media that are funded by the same mega corporation interests as mainstream media, there are no really differences. Basically, to recap it, this boils down to a war between mega corporations, federal government, against small independent ranchers and farmers. Because these are non-issues when it comes to, let's say, North Dakota pipeline issue. It got the approval regardless of being native lands, regardless of being, the damage and all the spill risks, all those things, it was approved. It got the stamp of approval because what are we talking about? We are looking at $1 trillion, multi-billion dollars companies and their interest, their profit at stake. Same thing. As long as these ranches, the farms are mega farms, mega ranches, owned and operated by mega companies, and there are a handful of them. And they get to use Monsanto products. They can pollute the environment. All those things, these are non-issues. There are no environmental issues raised by the federal government. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody gets to be prosecuted. However, this last frontier of the individual family-owned farms and ranches, They are target because our government, in bed with mega corporations, wants to see them gone. I mean, we basically, in so many ways, I went to Russia right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And basically, when you go to the market to shop, you had one brand, government-owned, one brand bread, government-owned, one brand bottled soda. Anything that you saw basically was owned by the government. Here in our country, what I'm seeing is when I go to the supermarket, when I see what is happening, it is basically everything is owned by 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 companies. I'm talking about Kraft or Kellogg. You're looking at mega corporations that manipulate and own the entire food industry, and that includes the agriculture. And it has been on this path since the 1940s, 1950s, and this is basically the escalation and unfortunately seems to be the end of the road of the government in bed with mega corporations set on eliminating any independent farmers and whether it's agricultural in terms of the ranchers or the vegetable farms or fruit tree farms. It is something that they want to put an end to. I mean, isn't it the case? Doesn't it really boil down to this?
Well, certainly from my perspective and from the Western perspective, the perspective of farmers and ranchers on the land out in the West, again, small, independent, I'm going to use the phrase self-sufficient, farmers and ranchers out there on the land putting those resources to beneficial use, they feel like there is a concerted effort to push them off the land. Why is that happening? I think we're talking about today in this interview some of the reasons why it's happening. A lot of people, when they really dig into this, feel like the United Nations Agenda 21 is all part of that objective. If you read and study that and see what's been done, and again, they make it sound like they're trying to do this because they have all these environmentally friendly terms and phrases that they use. Sustainable growth and green growth and responsible and this, that, and the other, to make it sound like it's all this environmentally friendly agenda. But really, if you drill down on it, I think that what they're really wanting to do is eliminate many of these truly environmentally friendly enterprises like sustainable ranching in the West, push the people off the lands where they can be controlled so that those big areas that really have nothing there now except ranchers to a large extent, they're removed, the population is removed to the cities so that there's nothing that stands in the way then of the powers that be, whoever and whatever they are, to completely monopolize and exploit these resources without any obstacles. Because even though the numbers of these ranchers and farmers are kind of few, they're a really independent lot. They're people like the Hammonds, like Cliven Bundy, like Lavoy Finicum. They're people that will try, some of them, to stand up for themselves. And sometimes they will actually work together and come to each other's aid. And when that happens, that scares the government and the other powers that be. They don't want that to happen, so they want to crush those people. They want to crush those people that stand up and make example. We've seen it just over the course of the last couple of years. The effort backfired. There's no question that it backfired. They brought these military forces to play, and they abused their power in every possible way, and it ultimately backfired. But there's no question that's what they were attempting to do, to make an example so that hopefully no one else in the foreseeable future would ever try to stand up or do anything like that again. I mean, it's the stuff movies are made of. You can see that theme over and over again in modern cinema. And the reality is that truth is stranger than fiction when it comes to this, because it's played out over the course of just the last few years here in the West. That's what's been going on. And this Hammond case is a fundamental part of that, Sibel.
Well, and that brings us to the issue of separation of powers, and when we are looking at states versus federal government. Now, in this particular case, let's talk about the states' roles. In this case, Hammond's case is in Oregon. We have other cases that have taken place in Nevada. And what are the roles of states in terms of authority granted under the Constitution? And are they using it? And if not, why?
Well, so, this is a debate. It's what I call the aftermath of the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate that resulted in ratification of the Constitution. This is exactly the same debate that the Federalists and the anti-Federalists were having after the Constitution was drafted and about whether or not it should be ratified by the original 13 colonies. It was exactly these kinds of issues, this conflict between the powers of the federal government and the states. And it's interesting that over the course of 200 plus years, even those who were Federalists at that time, because balanced federalism meant something very different at that time than it does today. Today, it's come to mean this whole concept of central government, that all power is basically consolidated in the federal government. But at that time, even the Federalists espoused a balanced federalism, basically where the states as a group had every bit as much power and held the federal government in check. That's no longer the case. Out here in the West, and that's why we've seen what we've seen in Oregon and Nevada, these states don't push back. They don't stand up for their own citizens. They don't stand up for these ranchers. They don't stand up to the federal government and say, hold on, wait a minute here. They just basically get out of the way and say, come on, we don't want to deal with this, so bring in the FBI, bring in the BLM and all your security forces and everything, and they don't give much pushback. And in my opinion, they are abdicating the role that they are supposed to be playing under the Constitution. They're just letting the federal government run roughshod, especially here in the West. I mean, you see some people and places stand up a little bit. I live in Utah. Utah's kind of taken a lead in trying to do something about this whole state versus federal issue with respect to these lands and resources in the West. But, it hasn't gained near as much traction as people would like to see it here in the West. And a big reason for that is the federal government just pushes back so hard. They have so many resources. They have so much power at their disposal that they can basically crush anybody that really tries to stand up to them. We've let it get that far. It's that far out of control is what it boils down to.
I'm so glad you used the word we, because I was just going to follow it up with this question. How about the role of the constituents? Considering the fact that in these Western states, ranching is one of the main backbone of the economy for these states, whether you're looking at, let's say, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and agricultural businesses, individually owned, family owned. Why is this being allowed? It's one thing to tackle this big, monstrous, ugly, disgusting federal government, Washington, D.C., but when you're looking at places like Oregon, Nevada, what about the constituents? Because the people who are refusing to exercise their power granted to them by the Constitution, these are the representatives, they're elected. So they can easily be unseated and unelected and replaced by those who actually represent these Western states and their constituents. And considering the population not being extremely high, like major urban areas we have, whether in California or on the East Coast, that doesn't seem to be a really daunting task for the ranchers, for the constituents, for the residents of these states to organize and say, we're going to give you the boot. You want to go and serve the federal government, just go to Washington, D.C. and ask for some kind of a damn contract job. But we want to elect the representatives who are going to represent our interests, the land's interests here in these Western states. And the interest being majority, basically, you are looking at the farmers and the ranchers. Why does this have to be a daunting task for these states?
Well, so I want to insert a couple things there, and one is the importance. And I think we've all just kind of been brainwashed at this point in time, the way things have developed and evolved, first with the Industrial Revolution and now with the informational revolution. And so now we have a population that I think to a large extent is not really well connected to reality. And the reality that I'm going to refer to is where our food comes from, how it's produced, and what goes into that. And most people are so far removed from that whole reality, they don't really care. And a lot of people have gotten to the point that they look at it and just say, agriculture is kind of, to a large extent, dirty and stinky, and it's hard work and it's labor intensive. So let's let that happen somewhere else in the world. We don't even need that to happen in the United States. We have such a lofty position in the world today. Why should we have to feed ourselves? Why should any of our citizens have to feed us? Let South America, let Brazil, let other places produce the food that we consume. And so I think that that's a growing mentality. And I think that that is a mentality that prevails in urban areas throughout the United States, including in the West. And so this is an important point I want to make, Sibel. So we look at the West, we look at Oregon, we look at Utah, Wyoming, Montana, just like you've described. But I think it is a little bit surprising. For example, Utah has a very high concentration of urban population. We've got, a population of pushing 3 million people, and 2.5 million of those people live in a metropolitan area that has completely pushed agriculture out. And you see the same thing in Oregon. It's the same in California, Washington. You have big population centers, and then you've got this vast area of arid agricultural land that's used for ranching, and it's really just sparsely populated. So when you compare the population of those rural areas to the populations of, say, Portland or Seattle or Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, Nevada, places like that, then those urban populations, they do have all the political power. It's the same in California. That's why there was this whole state of Jefferson movement, the northern part of California, because they didn't have truly representative government in their state government, because their state government was completely dominated by the major population centers. They couldn't outvote anything. They couldn't really have any true political power. And that's the way it is throughout the West. Here in rural Utah, rural Oregon, rural Washington, rural California, we have very little, if any, true political power because the population centers. And my good friend Trent Luce, who does Rural Route Radio and Loose Tales, he talks about this a lot, the conflicts between rural and urban America and rural and urban values. And they're growing, and we're talking about those conflicts right now, and I don't see those going away. There's a big piece that just came out yesterday in the New York Times, a very big piece, and my understanding is that it's a big part of it is going to be in the New York Times Magazine this coming Sunday, and the headline is the title of the piece is something like, "They're Trying to Destroy Us." And as I read an excerpt from it yesterday, I noticed that one of the people from Oregon that was quoted as saying that people in these rural areas don't understand why the people in the cities who they are trying to help feed want to destroy them. That is the perception. It really is the perception throughout the West. It's a perception that I subscribe to, that a lot of people who live in these urban areas really they don't care about those independent farmers and ranchers and family operators out there who are trying to help feed them. It's no skin off their nose if they are pushed off the land and completely destroyed, their livelihood, their lifestyle, everything about it. They just don't care about it.
Interesting, and it's very, very true. And as we know, perceptions are created, they are manufactured. Perceptions are not formed in a vacuum on their own. And the number one factor for these perceptions, these false perceptions to be in place, of course, is you're looking at the media, both kinds, pseudo-alternative mainstream media. You're looking at academia, and and to a certain degree, we are looking at the Hollywood portrayal of issues and cases. So these elements, again, all of these elements that I just talked about, they are governed, they are funded, they are owned, they are directed by a handful of special interest groups. I'm talking about big, mega corporations and the government. And
you're absolutely right.
They are selling these perceptions. They are forming and shaping these perceptions. And here we are, one of our guests, Doug Valentine, called small entities, independent entities like us, as mosquitoes. All we are doing is maybe have a little stink, maybe nuisance, and we are just like flies, we are shooed. But let's go back to this environmentalism issues. One of the issues we talked about yesterday with the 10th Amendment Center had to do with Utah, okay? Here we had the NSA, the National Security Agency, built this massive, I'm talking about massive, thousands and thousands of acres facility in Utah. And in order to run their machinery, and by the way, all the stuff that they run is to violate the Constitution and spy on us. So it's an unconstitutional operation ran by a federal government agency, to sum it up. So they set this place in Utah, and because of all the equipments, all the machines they have, they are sucking up the entire, basically, water resources of that area. To turn around for what? Is it for the good of the humanity? No. To surveil Americans, which is completely anti-Constitution. It's illegal. It's already known that it's illegal, but they are doing it anyway. But the federal government can build a massive facility for illegal operation, unconstitutional operations in Utah, and suck in all the resources, the water, from Utah, which is so needed because it's a precious commodity in Utah, and that is okay to the environmentalists. Yeah, some of the liberal, the left, they have problem and they are active about illegal surveillance, but for some reason, I haven't seen any environmentalists, really, groups like the ones who show up, the Soros-funded ones in thousands, and they're all equipped with the stuff, and millions of dollars is poured into them to organize them. None of them show up there to say, why are you destroying the land? Why are you taking in all these resources from the people, from the farmers, from the people? I mean, this includes people in the cities where water is a precious commodity. We don't see any of that. So what kind of a situation is this? And that includes people who live in urban areas in Utah. Why aren't we seeing more organizations in terms of organized grassroots activities saying, this is environmentally wrong, this is our precious commodity, resource, water, and we don't want this. And under the Constitution, Utah has the right to get rid of it, to put an end to it. We just talked about North Carolina finding out about federal government's illegal rendition program, using some of the air bases there, paid by North Carolina taxpayers' money. And once that came out, North Carolina booted them out. They kicked them. They said, no, you can't operate in North Carolina. You're not allowed to have these operations to get our taxpayers' resource, to get our land's resources. So it's doable. Here we have a precedent, a case that has happened. Why not in Utah?
Okay, so it's a complex issue, Sibel, and I completely agree with you. And The biggest reason there, in my opinion, that there hasn't been the kind of pushback that you're suggesting there ought to be is, again, back to the media. Who controls the media? What's the narrative that is being presented to the masses? And heaven knows it's not coming from you and me. It's a completely different narrative based on those well-funded sources. But really, I think in a nutshell, what it boils down to is you say why, and why doesn't the state, for example, stand up and stand their ground and do what we feel like they should do to protect our interests against the federal government. Now, this is interesting, and a lot of people won't know this, but when Utah does its budget every year, and again, I'm familiar with this because that's where I live, but it will be similar in the other western states. When Utah does its budget and they determine how they're going to spend all their billions of dollars, and Utah is supposed to be one of the best fiscally managed states in the union, and they collect X amount of money from property taxes and from income taxes and all of those things. But if you take all the property taxes and all the income taxes and add them up, they don't amount to, in terms of the whole pie of the income that the state of Utah receives, that it spends each year in its budget, the majority of all of its resources comes from the federal government. So really, that's the answer in a nutshell. The federal government has bought, all of these states are bought and paid for in terms of political power. So on one hand, we might have a governor that will stand up and say, I don't like this and I don't like that. And they're kind of like yapping chihuahuas in terms of what they say, because they'll say things, they'll give lip service to it, but on the other hand, they've got their hand out to the federal government. They take every bit of money the federal government ever offers, and that's, the federal government has bought the cooperation in the West. I mean, the cooperation, the West is bought and paid for by the federal government. That's what it boils down to in a nutshell. It's a money issue, and they know how to get the power, and they use money and they use the media to control the attitudes of the constituents. Like you say, if the constituents understood what was going on and felt strongly enough about it, they could stand up and do something about it. But they don't know what's going on because they don't all listen to you, Sibel, and other alternative media that paints the rest of the picture.
Well, you are not only an attorney and a rancher, but you're also an activist and educator. And I know how much of your time you have been putting in the last few years driving sometimes hundreds and hundreds of miles, going to different counties, whether it's in Utah, whether it's in Oregon, holding these seminars, educating the ranchers, the people, the residents there on the constitutional rights they have that they should be exercising, and on how to exercise these constitutional rights that they have, both, and both statewide and against a federal government overreach. As part of this, you recently put out this petition. What is it that you're trying to accomplish with this petition? We're going to be putting the link on our website. As soon as you went live with that petition, I signed it. I put my email address because it's an issue that I believe in. It's an issue that I used to be ignorant about. But thanks to the Malheur protests and what took place, I ended up finding out about Hammond's. And that itself was the success, the objective they had. Many people who didn't know about Hammond's case, they ended up finding out about it because the people, they couldn't get the media cover it. And this ended up being in a very, very high price injustice that took place in this entire Malheur case, which I'd like to have another session on. I signed this petition. I have been encouraging all the people I know, including my family members, to sign the petition. They have signed a petition. Tell us about this petition, what you're asking for, what you are asking for, and why.
Right. The issues we've described in this interview are broad, they're far-reaching. We're not going to fix all of that in this discussion, but if we narrow it down to this issue with respect to the Hammonds, Basically, what the petition asks for is for President Trump and the Department of Justice to closely analyze this case and the prosecutorial misconduct that occurred in the case and the gross injustice that ultimately resulted from being sentenced twice to serve a full 5 years. Now, again, compared to other cases that you might spend decades, but why? It seems just completely disproportionate to everybody who closely analyzes this that they should spend 5 years in prison for the consumption of less than $1,000 worth of sagebrush just because it's on federal ground. But the president has the power. He has the power to pardon. He has the power to commute sentences. We're not even asking that he pardon the Hammonds. It would be great if he did, but we are asking that he commute the remainder of their sentence. So Dwight Hammond was 73 years old when he went to prison. He's an older man. Steven Hammond is losing some of the best years of his life, rotting away in prison. We're asking the president and the Department of Justice to recognize this for what it is and to allow them to be released at this point in time based on the time that they've already served so that they can go back to their ranch, back to their families, pick up where they left off instead of continuing this injustice. And, you know, a lot of this story has kind of not gotten the attention that it might otherwise because of the Bundy case, the Bundy trials, the Lavoy Finicum situation. They all tie together, but a lot of those have reached some kind of posture of resolution at this point in time. And so we feel like the Hammond case has been on a back burner for these several years while those higher profile cases have been wending their way through the justice system. And we just don't want people to forget the Hammonds. We don't want the president to forget the Hammonds. We feel like they deserve to be released at this point. And the more people that say that, like you, like me, like everyone that speaks up, that signs the petition, that writes a letter, that goes to the website of the pardon attorney and makes comments, all of those help. And if we can do enough to gain enough traction and critical mass, we're hoping that the president will act on this. We're hoping that he will see the injustice and that he will take the steps that are necessary to allow them to go home. That's what it boils down to in a nutshell. Sibel, the Bundys, I think, now that we see in hindsight what really happened, they were political prisoners. We don't think that can happen in these United States, but it does happen. It did happen. It's now been proven that that was the case, and I believe that that's the case with the Hammonds too. They are political prisoners. They need to be able to be released and go home. That's what it boils down to in a nutshell.
And with that, we thank you, Todd Macfarlane. We are going to have you on again as a follow-up, and we will keep a close eye on this because I guess it's also important the method of delivery of this petition. Maybe it is something that, since we know the mainstream media is not going to cover this case, they have been consistent in one thing, and that is blacking out real, true stories of what is happening in this country. Is for delivery, if you think of some kind of an event, delivering it in D.C., we as Newsbud, we would be present, we would film it, we would provide coverage, and any other announcement between now until the end dates for the petition signatures that you have, again, we will be keeping our readers, our viewers up to date with the case. And our viewers, our community members, they know that we have been nonpartisan. We have a proven track record. We are not representing this party or that party or some middle party. And we have been, again, consistent with this. This is not an issue of partisan, one party against another, one ideology against another. This boils down to us, we the people here in the United States, our rights, the abuse of our rights, and our responsibility, our obligation for standing up for what is right for not Hammonds, for all of us. This is a case that affects all of us. And again, these types of cases, they set precedents. And people have to realize that when and if the government overreach the special interests, they get away with these and set precedents. We're going to be seeing more and more of these types of cases. And with each one of these setting precedents, we're going to make it much harder to counter. So the time to act is now. And again, we thank you, Todd, and we're going to be working with you and any other activities surrounding these issues that you may be planning. We would love to participate, and we would like to provide coverage.
Well, thank you, Sibel. Really appreciate your help with that. And I'm just going to add this, that time is of the essence, because what we're really trying to do, an entity called Protect the Harvest has taken a lead role in this. And what they're actually hoping to do is take those signatures, the petition, everything else that we can do between now and then, and have one of their representatives deliver that to President Trump at the State of the Union address that's coming up at the end of the month. And so we're hoping that we can really get some personal face time with this particular issue and see if we can't make it happen sooner rather than later. So we really appreciate your help and your coverage with this, Sibel.
Anytime.
Make your voice be heard. Be sure to sign and share the petition to free the Hammonds from federal prison.